I interviewed my mother, and my mother was born in Richmond in 1955, and then she moved to Broadmeadows when she was about 8 or 9 years old. The typical family back then consisted of 2 parents and about 3 to 5 children. My mother belonged to a nuclear family like this until her parents separated when she was about 15 years old. In my mum's area, divorce wasn't uncommon, and her parents' separation wasn't hushed up. It was quite public, like a lot of other families. Due to her father's alcoholism, there was lots of public displays of bad behaviour, so everyone had an idea. It wasn't uncommon, and neighbours could always hear everything, and this wasn't just my mother's family, my mother could hear neighbours' disputes as well. My mother lived in a housing commission estate, and it was a very low socio-economic area, and most people didn't have many personal belongings, and almost every family was living week to week. Neighbours would regularly come over to borrow money, food or cigarettes, and when I asked my mother what her youth was like, she told me it was very hard. She was living in a very dysfunctional family and she wasn't supported at all. She didn't have any she had very little personal belongings and not much personal space. She found school really hard because no one was interested in supporting her education. Her mother would never help her with homework or attended parent-teacher interviews. She never went on family holidays, and the closest thing she ever came to a trip was visiting her grandmother. She left school the day she turned 16 and began a full-time job the next day. She had to do this because of her family's financial situation after her mother had left, and she needed some supporting income. She gave 1/3 of her pay, which was $30 a week, to her mother and spent the rest on her own needs. My mother was asthmatic, and she had to pay for her own health care. There were massive episodes of family violence, and it wasn't looked at in the same way it is now. If her mother had ever tried to report the abuse, they were simply dismissed. The police attitude was more so what happens behind closed doors stays behind closed doors. When my mother grew up, discipline was physical. In schools, children were strapped and hit with rulers, and at home, it was pretty much the same. And that was not just my mother's family, this was very typical for the families within her area. Physical punishments such as belting, punching, strapping with electrical cords and belts were quite common. There was no such things as time out for kids, it was always physical. And this wasn't just in my mum's family, she reports being able to hear neighbours begging their parents to stop. My mother had lots of chores. They were simple stuff such as setting the table and cleaning the house. She always had to do her own laundry by hand because they had no washing machine. And my mother says that her mother was not very helpful and they practically looked after themselves in every aspect. The typical home, especially in this area, was very small, single story, 3 bedrooms and 1 toilet, which was normally at the back of the house on the back porch near the laundry. Although they did have a large garden, and you'll still see houses like this in some areas. They celebrated typical events such as Easter, Christmas, blah blah blah. But honestly, she didn't really have disagreements with her parents because she wasn't really parented by them. She spent a lot of time on the street and not so much in the house, so there wasn't a lot for them to fight about. Religion, she wasn't part of a very religious family, although they were socially connected through things such as church groups and Sunday school, although this only happened when she was much younger and it stopped when she moved to Broadmeadows. Family life in comparison to what my mother's era is very different. It's a lot more affluent now and people are having less children. It's not common to have 3 children sharing 1 bedroom anymore. And attitudes towards social problems with their families is very different. Family violence is not tolerated anymore. We have protective services such as child protection, DHS connections, all these sorts of things to help intervene when children are being abused within their home. Kids used to spend a lot of time in the street, whether this was a lack of space within the house or parents didn't want them around. And nowadays kids have Xboxes and televisions and computers, and some kids even have these in their own bedroom and they're not really going outside. Another thing that's different about families these days is when my mother was a young person, it was a very monocultural society and there weren't a lot of interracial couples or half-race children, and especially in my mother's area. Nowadays, that's very common. Another thing about family life is that children are recognised as people with rights and no longer just and the attitude of children are to be seen and heard is not there anymore. And yeah, thank you.